So this is the last of the court tales in Daniel's book. Remember, we at the very beginning had an outline where the first 6 chapters of Daniel were these various court tales where Daniel and his friends were involved in the court at Babylon and then later here in Persia. And then starting in chapter 7, we'll pick up and see a series of visions that are occurring while Daniel is laboring at court. Many of the visions from chapters 7 through 12 will occur toward the end of his life and ministry in Babylon/Persia. But that's next time. Today, we're in the last of the court scenes. And just to continue to remind you, chapters 2 to 7 represent a unique section within the overall book of Daniel. This section that's written in Aramaic, so the language of the Chaldeans, of the Babylonians. It was kind of the lingua franca of the day, the public language that certainly Jews could read Aramaic, but so could Babylonians, so could Persians. It was kind of like English, the language in which you did business, if you will. And so this public document, chapters 2 to 7, was meant to display certain truths about God, most centrally that God, the King, is able to humble those who exalt themselves against him. But there were other truths in this public document, and one of them centers on refusing to pray to false gods and how God, Israel's God, is able to deliver his people from the pit or from the fiery furnace, or in this instance, from the lion's den. And so I've just reminded you in your notes of this chiastic structure, this sandwich structure, A, B, C, C, B, A pattern, which means then that you might expect to find some measure of parallel between chapter 3 and chapter 6, which we're looking at today. And just so you see some of those parallels just off of your own reading, you probably picked this up. But in chapter 3, remember, there Daniel's 3 friends were required or commanded to pray to their gods through this golden mediator, this feat that Nebuchadnezzar had made, this 90-foot gold statue that represented Nebuchadnezzar himself. So Babylon was to pray to their gods through their mediator Nebuchadnezzar. Well, here in this chapter, the decree is that Persia, the empire, was to pray to their gods through their mediator Darius. So very similar in terms of the presenting issue of the 2 chapters. In chapter 3, the threatened punishment was, you'll be thrown into a fiery furnace, and that was repeated 3 times. Here, in chapter 6, the threatened punishment is that you'll be thrown into a lion's den, a lion's pit. In the previous scene in chapter 3, the 3 friends refuse to bow down, even though they know the likely result. Even if he does not deliver us, O king, we will not bow down. In Daniel 6, Daniel bows down to his God, even though he knows the likely result, that he's going to be caught. He doesn't hide, right? He does this in public. The doors are open. Everyone sees. He bows down to his God, even though he knows the likely result, that he'll be thrown into the lion's den. In Daniel chapter 3, a 4th, one like a son of man, a son of God, joins the friends in the fiery pit, ostensibly to deliver them. In Daniel 6, the Lord sends an angel, the angel of the Lord, joins Daniel in the lion's den to deliver him. At the end of Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar praises Israel's God as the one who's able to deliver. Here at the end of Daniel 6, Darius will praise Israel's God as the God who's able to deliver and rescue. So you see, there's these parallels are quite intentional. They're meant to signal the same message, that God is able to deliver his people out of difficulty and persecution and distress. He's the one, as Darius will put it at the end of his hymn of praise, he is the one who delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So it's a message of comfort ultimately to God's people, but also a message of confrontation to the empires, right? Because if Israel's God is able to deliver his people out of distress, out of the hand of their enemies, what does that make Babylon? And what does that make Persia? It makes them less than godlike. It makes them standing against the true king of the world. And ultimately, that means the true king of the world is not only able to deliver his people, he's able to use the Persians to be the means of Israel's deliverance, as we saw last time. Cyrus the Great prophesied in Isaiah 45 as the one who would actually be the Messiah, the anointed one, who will lead God's people back to the promised land. And in fact, if we were doing a chronological study, by the time Darius the Mede comes to the throne of Babylon, who is representing Cyrus the Great, Cyrus is issuing a decree at the beginning of Ezra so that God's people might go back to the promised land and go back to rebuild the temple. All that's happening around the same time. So God's able to deliver his people out of difficulty, persecution, and distress. But in order to see that, just notice how this chapter opens up. It opens with an account of Darius' administration. You see that in verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials or presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So we met Darius at the end of the previous chapter, and as I mentioned that last time, whether he's Cyrus the Great's general or his vassal ruling in Babylon, or if in fact Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Great were the same person, as I mentioned, chapter 6, verse 28 could be rendered, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, that is, the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Regardless of how you understand that, he's the one who's ruling, and he has an org chart, or at least my best guess at an org chart. So I put that in your notes, which was kind of fun to do with Microsoft Word. So you have Darius the king at the head, CEO, and then he has, if you will, 3 presidents under him, and one of those presidents is Daniel, and then the 120 satraps were likely divided, 40 satraps, think of them as middle managers, 40 satraps reporting to each president, who himself is reporting to Darius the king. I think it's likely that this is how the whole deal was set up. In some ways, when you look at this chart, you can see that what Belshazzar had promised Daniel in the previous chapter has come true. Right? I mean, when Daniel interpreted the writing on the wall, the previous chapter ended, Belshazzar gave the command, Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Well, even after Darius the Mede, the Persians come in and take control, Daniel is retained as a, if you will, 3rd ruler in the kingdom. And his task was to make sure that the king might suffer no loss, verse 2. That is, no loss financially. As a senior administrator in the Darius administration, he was to make sure that the taxes and tributes were collected efficiently and accurately, that there'd be no corruption and no graft. And at least with his satraps, Daniel was really good at his job. In fact, he was so good that verse 3 tells you that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. He was going to be second command, prime minister, and everyone else was going to report to him. It was because of his accuracy in his job, but also because an excellent spirit was in him, verse 3, which reminds you of what the Queen Mother had said, what Belshazzar said, what Nebuchadnezzar had said previously, that the spirit of the holy gods was in Daniel. And Darius recognized that, recognized his efficiency as an administrator, recognized his character, and so he was going to place him as prime minister, which meant that the other guys on the org chart were not happy about that, right? How can this guy, how can he have all the power? He's going to cut us out. We're going to have to report to him. Who wants that? And so the other leaders, the presidents and the satraps, they wanted to prevent that. We think it's likely jealousy, but we're not exactly told why. But in order to prevent that, what did they do? Well, just like a modern-day politician, they tried to dig up some dirt, right? I mean, that's what they tried to do. Verse 4, then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. So the NCA Committee on Compliance comes in and digs through all the records, right? All kinds of shady transactions, all the dark money, and they try to figure out, was Daniel involved? And nope, the books are clean. Daniel's fully compliant. There's no ground for complaint or any faults. That's what verse 4 tells you. Why? Because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. And just notice that there's a repetition there in verse 4 that's meant to emphasize the fact that Daniel was faultless, that Daniel was above reproach. They sought to find a ground for complaint, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, and no error or fault was found in him. That threefold repetition, again, it's the Bible's way of drawing a bold or an italics there, so it catches your attention. Daniel was blameless. There was only one area where these presidents and satraps and other officials might be able to strike a blow against Daniel. Where is that? Well, verse 5. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. I just pause there for a minute. That's actually a pretty cool thing, isn't it? I mean, that Daniel was that well known as a follower of Yahweh, that when they were going to try to figure out how to trap him, that it was going to be in his loyalty to his God. Now, it's underhanded, to be sure, and yet, how does that speak of Daniel's character? To be so known by his co-workers, by those in the kingdom, as a follower of Yahweh, that they said, well, he's above reproach. There's nothing we can pin on him. So if we're going to get him, it's going to have to be some kind of trick or deception in connection with his religion, with his faith in his God. I think that speaks well of Daniel's character. It certainly serves as the basis for the leaders' deception. They come by agreement to the king in verse 6. Then these high officials or presidents and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. Now, before you get too far past verse 6, the ESV has a little footnote there right by the phrase came by agreement. It says at the bottom, came thronging. That Aramaic phrase, it has a shared root with a Hebrew word that shows up especially in Psalm 2, where the psalmist begins, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain against the Lord and his anointed? Well, it's that same verb. And so you get a sense of the nations raging, not just against Daniel. Well, who are they ultimately raging against as they try to deceive and trap Daniel? Well, they're raging against Daniel's God. This is ultimately a test concerning Yahweh in the end of the day, whether Daniel was right to trust him and to be known as a Yahweh follower. And so they come thronging, raging against Daniel to the king. And they say, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, there's hyperbole for you, the prefects and satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So part of the deception that they practice here is their alleged united front. They say all the high officials, the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and satraps, which presumably, the way they presented it, would include Daniel, but of course Daniel would have never agreed to pray to his God through Darius the Mede. And even the request itself, even the decree itself, has an element of hyperbole. Whoever makes any petition to any god or man for 30 days, so that means that I can't ask you to pass the ketchup. I can't ask you to lend me some money. I have to go directly to Darius. No, obviously it's hyperbole. It was meant to focus especially on any petition to a god. It has to be, in a sense, made through the king. There's an element of mediation that's being requested there. So their deception is practiced first on their united front, their alleged united front, but also in the nature of their request. It's an impossible request at some level. But embedded in it is a kind of hook. They're hiding their real intention. The king can't really figure out what's going on. And part of the reason why maybe he was taken in by this is that Persian kings didn't view themselves as deities. So Egyptian kings saw themselves as representatives of the sun god Ra, and in a sense they were sons of the gods, sons of Ra, ruling in their stead as kinds of deities. But Persian kings didn't think of themselves in that term. For that matter, Babylonian kings didn't either. They were representatives of Marduk, or as we talked about a little bit, Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father, saw himself as a representative, an advocate for the moon god Shin. But they didn't see themselves as deities in the same way, say, as Egyptian gods or later, Egyptian kings or later Roman emperors. And so Darius would not have viewed this necessarily as a religious action. He would have seen this more as a political maneuver. Let's unite the kingdom around you, king, so that all of our focus for the next 30 days in this new administration will be on you. You're the one we'll honor. You're the one we'll praise. You're the one that we'll esteem. And that will unite us around you. That's undoubtedly how he thought about this. I don't think he necessarily thought that this was an exclusivist religious decree, that everyone could only ask of things through him or from him. Perhaps that's why he was taken in by the deception. But the hook in what's being asked for, the hook in the deception, was that this is an unchangeable decree. That's verse 8, and it's, again, repeated multiple times, both in this, well, starting in verse 8, but then especially once the hook is fully set. Verse 8, now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Already you hear it. It cannot be changed. It cannot be revoked. That's going to be picked up again in verse 12 and verse 15. You know, the leaders, I think, knew that once Darius discovered their real intention, which was this was all a deception in order to condemn his proposed prime minister, he'd try to wriggle off the hook. And so right here, as they're asking for the decree, they foreshadow, now this can't be changed. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, it cannot be revoked. And Darius, unaware, signs the document in the injunction. Now, just for a moment, think about the nature of this deception, because there's all kinds of ways in which this happens to us today. And whether it's in the workplace where people seem to be saying one thing, but they really want to hook you in a different way, but even more spiritually. The Puritan, I think it was Thomas Brooks, Precious Remedies for Satan's Devices, talks about how when Satan comes with his temptations, he always comes by way of deception. He presents the bait, if you will, on the hook and doesn't present the hook. So, oh, this is going to feel so good, or this is going to make you feel so powerful, or this is going to get what you want, or this is going to put her in her place. You see the bait, you don't see the hook. And it's not until later where Satan then pulls the hook in that you realize that you've been taken in by his wiles, by his deceptions, by his devices. And you realize, oh, this was his intent all along. It was to do me damage in this way. Satan still works that way. He works that way with us all the time. And so paying attention to those voices in our head saying, oh, this will be okay. She'll never know. He'll never know. They'll never know. God never will know. It's the voice that's trying to lead you down a path. It's trying to deceive you in certain ways, hiding a hook that's later to come, which is exactly what happens in the scene. The hook is revealed once it's clear what their intentions were. Well, what's interesting is Daniel knows all of this. I think he suspects what's going on, that in fact, this is all about trying to entrap him. And knowing that, he signals his determination to continue on doing what is right. Verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he knew what the document said, he knew what was going to happen, he went to his house where he had his windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem, and he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. The Old Testament commentator Ralph Davis, in commenting on this scene, points out that we learn a lot about Daniel's prayer life from what he does here. The defiance of prayer. When he knew, well, he prayed anyway. He knew what was going to happen. He knew the document had been signed. He knew that there was going to be danger ahead. But he said, no, actually, I'm going to obey God rather than man. I'm going to stay committed to what I've always done in my obedience to God rather than listen to the have-to of men. So that there was a kind of defiance in what he was doing, that he was committed to his God come what may, and he didn't hide it, right? It wasn't like he knew the document was signed but said, you know what, the better part of valor here would be to keep those windows closed, and I'm going to turn out the light, and in fact, I'm going to go into the closet and just hide in there, and I can still pray just as well in the closet as I can with my windows open. No, he didn't do that. He was defiant in his praying. He opened his windows as he always had done. He knew that he would be seen, and he didn't stop praying 3 times a day. He continued to do what he knew God had called him to do, which was to pray to him. You see, too, the focus of his prayer. He prays toward Jerusalem. It's striking that when the temple is dedicated and Solomon is praying to God as part of that prayer of dedication for the temple, and he says in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 46, if they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them, and give them to an enemy, so they are carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near. Yet, if they turn their heart in the land to which they have been carried captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned and acted perversely and wickedly. If they repent with all their mind and with all their heart in the land of the enemies and who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who sinned against you, and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them, for they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Well, what's Daniel doing? He's in the land of his enemies, in the land of his captors. And just as Solomon had prayed hundreds of years before, Daniel was doing. He had turned literally his face toward his land, toward the city, toward the place where the temple had been, because of course the temple was destroyed. And he prays, and likely, as I'm going to say here momentarily, he prays the content of what you find in Daniel chapter 9, confessing the sin of his sin and his ancestors' sins, so that they might be restored and God might rescue them. So Daniel focuses his prayer in line with what Scripture taught him to pray. There's also a posture here. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed. Now, posture is not something that is required throughout the Bible. People pray standing up, they pray sitting down, they pray kneeling, they pray with uplifted hands. And yet, in order to signal his obedience to his God and his position before him, he got down on his knees to tell himself and those who were watching him he was submissive to a higher king than Darius the Mede. The content of his prayer, he made petition and plea The text says in verse 11, these men came by agreement. Again, they're raging, and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. And it's likely, and we'll come back to this in a few weeks, likely the content that you find in Daniel 9. It's interesting, Daniel 9 opens, Daniel 9:1, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king of the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, and what did he do? Verse 3, I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. And so just as 1 Kings 8 had suggested, Solomon had prayed all the way at the beginning in around 940 or 970 BC, hundreds of years later, 400 years later, Daniel picks up on that and makes petition and plea for his people, confessing sin, seeking restoration, seeking renewal, the content of his prayer. And then the consistency of his prayer. He prays 3 times a day, verse 10 says, as he had done previously. He didn't stop praying as he had always done. I think there's great lessons here for us, isn't there? Great lessons for us is in a determination to be God's, to belong to God, and not to belong to ourselves or to be forced about by the opinion of others. Well, Jimmy is on this travel baseball team, and we just have to play on Sunday and miss church. We have a tournament in Birmingham, we have a tournament in Nashville, we have a tournament in Little Rock. We just have to do this. Well, where's our determination? Is our determination to be pushed about by the winds of our culture or the opinions of others, or is our determination to obey God rather than men? To be consistent and determined in seeking the face of our God, consistently, determinedly, defiantly, recognizing that he's God and we in our culture are not. Well, of course, Daniel knows what's going to happen. And so what you see next is the enemy's accusation and the king's acquiescence to their accusation. Verse 11, these men came by agreement, found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, this thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said, the hook is set. Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he had heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement. 3rd time that Aramaic word is used. They come raging to the king and saying to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God whom you serve continually deliver you. So as they thought likely Daniel's raging enemies, they discover him violating the king's decree. They go running quickly as they can to report it all to the king. And they emphasize, as we saw, that the hook has been set. You can't change this. You can't wriggle off the hook. He tries to deliver Daniel, but he finds he can't. And so he declares to Daniel that he believes that Daniel's God's going to deliver him. The ESV renders this as a kind of wish. May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. Actually, the construction is really probably closer to your God, whom you serve continually, will deliver you. There's a sense in which Darius is not wishing, he's expecting, he's hoping. There's a genuine hope and expectation that Daniel will be delivered, as in fact happens. Daniel's deliverance leads to the king's declaration concerning his God. It's interesting that the king and the lions are both going to spend the night fasting. Isn't that striking? A stone was brought, laid on the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lords, and nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. He didn't eat. The lions didn't either. No diversions were brought to him. Sleep fled from him. I suspect Daniel probably stayed awake too. Maybe he slept. I probably, even if the angel of the Lord came and shut the mouths of the lion, I'd probably have at least one eye open just to make sure those lions don't come and get me. Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. He was hoping but not expecting. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" That's the key question. Has your God been able? This is about the ability of God to deliver. Has your God been able to deliver you from the lions? And for the very first time in this chapter, Daniel speaks. Right, we see Daniel speaking, but we don't hear his words. Here, Daniel speaks for the first time. And what does he say? My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. My God shut the lions' mouths. Has your God been able to deliver you? My God shut the lions' mouths. Yes. Now, it wasn't because, these lions' mouths didn't stay closed because they weren't hungry, right? How do we know? Well, because of what happens in verse 24. The king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces and presumably had a great meal. I mean, they were clearly hungry, which means this was clearly a divine deliverance. And here you see the parallel to Daniel 3, when one like the son of the gods is walking a forth in the midst of the fiery furnace. They come out, and what happens? Everyone inspects them, right? All the officials come up, and they check out Daniel's three friends, and not a hair was singed. Their clothes weren't singed. There wasn't even the smell of smoke on them. That same kind of deliverance is worked here. In verse 23, the king was exceedingly glad, commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him. This is clearly a divine deliverance. And the king's declaration emphasizes this. But it's striking. It also emphasizes the theme that's run throughout all of these chapters. Namely, Israel's God is the true king of the world. Did you get that? In verse 26, I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So yes, this God delivers and rescues, but this God is able to deliver and rescue because he's the king. His dominion shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. Right? Chapter 2, the boulder that comes and destroys the multi-metalled statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream is what? It's the kingdom of God filling the world. Chapter 3, one like the Son of Man, the sons of the gods, is walking in the midst to emphasize what? That Israel's God is the true king. Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar's cut down like a tree. And what does he declare? His dominion is an everlasting dominion. No one can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Daniel 5, the handwriting on the wall. Who's the one who ultimately deals with Belshazzar? Well, it's Israel's God. You've been weighed and found wanting. Your kingdom has come to an end. Here in Daniel 6, the same message is given, which tells you what? Why is this important? This is a public document. So it's public not just to Israel, it's public to the nations. And it's telling the nations, you may think you're gods, and you may think you're the most powerful thing in the world, but you're not. Israel's God, not Israel, Israel's God. He's the true king of the world, which is a vitally important message for us today. I mean, with all the fear of coronavirus, or all the fear of, this is an election cycle, or all the fear of what China will do. Of course, they're not doing a whole lot right now because of the virus. But I mean, all the different things that are going on, we tend to, there's forces in this world. No. Israel's God, your God, the God of the church who's come to us in Jesus Christ, he's the true king of the world. Our trust is in him. That's part of the big lesson that Daniel 6 presents. This God who is the true king of the world, he's able to deliver his people and rescue them from all sorts of lions, whether Assyria, whether Babylon, whether Persia. The parallel scene, as I mentioned, Daniel 9, which is a series of visions, at the end of it, and we'll talk about this when we get there. I doubt I'll provide a satisfactory answer, but the whole issue of the 70 weeks at the end of Daniel 9, whatever the 70 weeks mean, the larger message of the 70 weeks is God's the one who sets the timetable. He's the one who's control of the whole script so that as these 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression and put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity and to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet and to anoint the most holy place, who's in control of those 70 weeks? Who's in control of the times? Who's in control of the seasons? God is. And we can trust in him. But we can trust in him not only because he's in control of the times, but because he's actually come to us in our faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. It's striking the parallels between Daniel chapter 6 and the Passion Week of Jesus Christ. I mean, think about it. Jesus is utterly innocent. He's blameless in the sight of all, just as was said of Daniel. He's faithfully serving his God continually, just as was said of Daniel. And he's framed, trapped by jealous men. They plotted for his destruction. And the Gentile authority, Pilate, he attempted to deliver Jesus, remember? He suggested, well, let me release to you Jesus, son of the Father. And we'll go ahead and condemn Jesus, Barabbas, Jesus, this other son of the Father. And the crowds end up choosing Barabbas over Jesus. But Pilate tries to release Jesus under paschal amnesty. But in the end, Jesus is crucified under Pontius Pilate, just as Daniel's thrown into the lion's den under Darius the Mede. Jesus is cast into the pit, into the grave. It's a literal hole in the ground, this garden tomb in which there's a hole that's dug out of the rock, this new tomb that was prepared for Joseph of Arimathea. He's placed into the grave. There he remains under the power of death and the darkness of that place, just as the ever-present reality of dying was there with Daniel in those lions. So Jesus remains under the power of death and the darkness of the grave. And his pit was sealed as well. Did you notice? In Daniel 6, the king seals the stone with his own signet and the signet of his lords. In Matthew, that's what happens. Pilate gives his ring to the Jewish authorities and says, make it as secure as you can. And the grave is sealed with the very ring of Pilate. And yet, Jesus is raised from the pit by the power of God, and he's delivered with no kind of harm that death could bring. Yes, he has the marks, the nail prints on his hands and on his feet, and the hole in his side, and yet he's delivered. Death could not hold him down. Death could not destroy him. And so at the end of these court tales, we see how God is with his people from beginning to end, but we also begin to see there's one like a Son of Man coming. One who's going to rule over his kingdom. One who's going to be the promised Davidic king. God's going to keep his promises, and we're going to see in the next chapter, in Daniel chapter 7, how that's the case. How the promises of God will be fulfilled in this one who's like the Son of Man. But with those things in mind, and there's lots here in this chapter, a familiar scene that hopefully we have further insight on. I've got some questions for you there at the end of your notes. Go ahead and take the next 20 minutes or so and talk about some of these things and discuss what you've learned through Daniel 6.